Yeah, hello everybody. I hope you had a wonderful Christmas time and I wish you all the best for the new year. We continue with our lectures on representations and today we are concerned with emotions. And for you it will be perhaps a bit funny that especially with emotions this is a very theoretical lecture and I hope it will not get too difficult. For a long time, feelings, considered to be a realm of other than that of reason, were taboo in scholarly discourse. Seen as irrational, subjective, and therefore unscientific, they were excluded from scientific inquiry. This was, and to an extent still is, true in the case of art history. As a result, art history has found itself ignoring essential levels of production and reception. However, over the past 20 years, we have been witnessing something of an emotion boom. Everywhere people are talking about affect and emotions. Lectures, conferences, publications, research projects devoted to this topic are flooding the market, so to speak. It's already a bit over now, but it was a few years ago, it was really a hype. This new turn that things have taken is not the result of any initiative on the part of the liberal arts, or of the disciplines of aesthetics and art history, or the study of culture, or even of psychology, the discipline that, since the beginning of the modern era, is supposed to be responsible, as it were, for everything having to do with feelings. No, it was neurobiology that triggered the change in attitude. Ever since neurobiologists such as Antonio Damasio, Joseph Ledoux, Wolf Singer, Karen Kaplan-Solms and Mark Solms and others proved in the early 1990s the close interconnection between thought and feeling in the human brain, many disciplines have begun to concern themselves with human emotions. These disciplines include sociology, philosophy, history, the study of culture, media, communications, and film studies, and others. Antonio Damasio in particular, with his writings on brain processes, has contributed considerably to popularizing the results of brain research. On the one hand, I personally find it irritating and disconcerting that it took neuroscience to make us finally overcome the dichotomy of mind, reason versus feeling. A dichotomy that had been so deeply anchored in the hegemonic discourse. On the other hand, however, we might see in this development a chance to reflect critically on our Western structure of thought. In the disciplines that concern themselves with the study of culture, a certain euphoria can be observed about the fact that in the discourse surrounding the notion of affect, a connection was able to be established with the natural sciences, and in particular with the leading science of our day, namely neurobiology. But here, of course, there are also skeptical voices that make themselves heard. And they draw attention to the irreconcilable differences that exist between an approach oriented towards the study of culture and that adopted by the natural sciences. In particular, there has justifiably been criticism of the illusory notion that there exists independently of language, a direct way of knowing the essential truths about our feelings. The desire for affect, the affective dispositive, the presence of which can be perceived not only in fields of scholarly inquiry, but also in the arts and the world of the net, is analyzed as being an illusory yearning for direct experience, accompanied by the rejection of the notion of the split subject. And of course, a rejection of the importance of language. What we should find equally perplexing is a parallel that can be drawn between the present euphoria surrounding emotions on the one hand, and on the other hand, the strategies that those who pull the strings of power and politics employ in order to manipulate and dominate. Having recourse to neurobiology becomes problematic whenever the assumption is, and in most cases the assumption is indeed, that emotions are anthropological constants, determined by nature, unrelated to history, and equally innate to all human beings. What is meant by an analysis of emotions from the perspective of disciplines that concern themselves with the study of culture, Kulturwissenschaften, and what is meant by an analysis of emotions from the point of view of art history, and specifically art history that is oriented towards the study of culture, of representation. In what follows, I proceed on the assumption that although emotions unquestionably have biological components, they are also culturally coded. They have undergone change over the course of history. And they can only be conveyed through, and to an extent even fashioned by, language and various forms of representation. What interests me is a discourse concerning the meaning, function, and evaluation of emotions, and how this discourse relates to individual aesthetic works that have been produced. In pursuing my investigation, I draw not only on research done in the field of art history, but also and especially on work done in the last years in the field of cultural study and history. There have been very different views as what causes emotions, and very different views as how emotions should be evaluated. This is all tied up with questions such as the relationship between the body and the soul, the mind, the question as to what is internal and what is external, the question of visibility and invisibility, the question of culture versus nature, the connection between rationality and feeling, and the connection between emotions and irrationality, emotions and gender, the conscious and the subconscious, the relationship between emotions and cognition, knowledge acquisition, and what is the relationship between emotions and volition. For art history in particular, the central question is that of representation. What are the specific ways in which the arts, the visual media, are able to portray or depict or evoke emotions? What effects are employed and what are they meant to achieve? we will never be able to know what people have felt in former times. We are only able to comprehend what has been said and written about emotions, and in what disciplines and how, and in what context emotion have been represented. I would like briefly to explain a few key notions here. On various levels, there is bewildering confusion when it comes to some of the notions that concern us here and their use. As far as semantics are concerned, affect, emotion, passion and feeling, for example, are understood and used differently according to scholarly or scientific discipline and also according to language. Not only that, semantic differences can also be noted in specific forms of daily language and specialized discourse. Here it might be helpful to look at things from a historical point of view. Such an approach would show, for example, that the English noun affect, like German affekt, is ultimately derived from Latin affectus, the original translation of the Greek term pathe or pathos. Up until the early modern era, the Latin term was always used parallel to the term passiones, passions, or emotions, and its semantics therefore differed from the modern day use of the terms affect. So actually it is extremely complicated because the use of these terms are so differentiated, but I will skip this part because it gets too complicated. I just wanted you to realize that in language, these notions of affect, emotion, feeling are used very differently. Too little attention is paid to the topoi, that is, the places from which discussion of emotions emanates. Theology, philosophy, psychology, the neurosciences, art, language, pictures, music. Art historians often proceed on the assumption that pictures and emotions in pictures can be explained with texts, as if pictures were always illustrations of texts. But it is important to realize that in the case of visual representations and music, of course, we are able to perceive quite different things and to appreciate emotions quite differently than in the case of language. And as for language, it seems important to me to make a distinction between normative discourse and artistic literary forms, like poetry, for example. We should perhaps recognize the need for a history of how emotions have been talked and written about. How has such discussion changed over time? What significance, what function has historically been ascribed to emotions? How have they been evaluated? The relationship between the body and the mind or spirit? How has this notion been interpreted over the course of history? Have emotions been seen as being triggered by external stimuli or by internal stimuli? Were emotions moralized or were they not? It seems to me self-evident that when a certain emotion is considered to be a deadly sin, for example, such an evaluation has an effect on the systematic structure of the way in which an individual experiences things. Christianity declared the human being's basic emotions or drives as deadly sins. For instance, luxuria, lust, invidia, envy, gulo, Gula, gluttony, or timor, fear. What a difference compared with antiquity. Aristotle saw feelings as necessary. For the Stoics, what mattered was the notion of the right balance or proper measure. But already here we see the beginnings of moralization. In the High Middle Ages, the number of deadly sins was often 12, and not as we used to 7. They now included timor, fear. For example, and here, the conclusion you had to come to was, not only do I suffer because of fears, even if they are unfounded, I have also to see them as a deadly sin. Big help. How does this moral evaluation affect a person's emotional inner life? How is this state of affairs interpreted in art? Are the norms simply passed on as such? As I see, the norms are often contradicted, both intentionally and unintentionally. Let's concentrate now on the 17th century, and specifically on Rembrandt. This focus on the 17th century had a reason, namely, it is during this century that we can observe an apogee in the discussion surrounding emotions. That's something very similar what happens today. Firstly, I would like to show you ways in which emotions are portrayed in art, and specifically in the art of Rembrandt. And secondly, I would like to demonstrate what it means to analyze these artistic representations from the perspective of the study of culture. In other words, what it means to contextualize them culturally. Rembrandt is, and always has been, considered to be the master when it comes to portraying feelings. This opinion was already held by Constantine Huygens, secretary to Frederick Henry, Prince of Orange, Count of Nassau, and himself a poet and one of the most erudite men of letters of this time. He was literally exhilarated by Rembrandt's ability to portray emotions. In Huygens' autobiography, written in 1629, he eulogized Rembrandt's early work entitled Judas Repentant, Returning to the 30 Pieces of Silver. This is very seldom that we really, have a source where somebody who lived at the same time writes about a concrete painting we still have. So I will quote now from Huygens' autobiography. As an example, I will mention the painting of the repentant Judas returning the pieces of silver, to the high priest. His wage for betraying the Lord, an innocent man. One can compare it with all that Italy has brought for us. Indeed, all the marvels and beauty that have been handed down to us since earliest antiquity. The gestural expression of this one man Judas, not to mention of all the other remarkable figures in this single painting. This man fallen victim to despair, this Judas, completely out of his senses, crying out, pleading for forgiveness, a man who truly has no more hope. Every trace of hope has been erased from his countenance. The crazed look on his face, his disheveled hair, his torn clothing, the twisting of his arms, his hands fiercely clasped together. In a blind frenzy, he has fallen to his knees, his entire body writhing pathetically, hideously. I hold this one painting up to all the beauty that centuries have brought for us. I want to hold it up for all to see, all those fools who maintain that today nothing more can be created or expressed in words that was not already expressed or created in antiquity. I stand by what I've already stated, namely, neither protagonists nor Apelles or Pathos, these are all the very famous artists of antiquity, could ever have been conceived, or should any one of them ever walk on earth again, would he ever been able to conceive what one young man, a Dutchman, a miller, who does not even yet have a beard, has expressed in a single human figure and rendered in its totality. I'm full of amazement as I say these words. Hail to you, Rembrandt. To have brought Troy, indeed all of Asia, to Italy was a lesser achievement than to have bestowed the glory of Greece and Italy upon Holland. And this was a deed of a Dutchman, one who has hardly yet ventured beyond the gates of his native city. End of quote. So you see, Huygens is completely, he can't even find the words how to describe this painting, and if you see the painting, you can also see that he actually exaggerates, because there are some things that you even can't see in this painting. But the point is that never before anyone had painted feelings, human feelings like this. Now I would like to look closely at the following emotions. I want to show you some of the emotions always in Rembrandt, and the first will be love, and then pain and guilt, and above all the phenomenon of ambivalent emotions. So we start with love. How can love be portrayed? Love is an emotion. Today in German we would use the term Gefühl, which is most often translated as feeling in English. Whereas in the 17th century one spoke of Gemütsbewegung, a term that, taken literally, expresses the idea of movement of mood. There are emotions that can be portrayed to the extent that they manifest themselves as facial expressions or gestures. Take anger, for example, or fear, fright, astonishment, even hatred or aggression. One need only think of Rembrandt's early graphic works, which include self-portraits that show him in various affective states. But love? And here when I say love, I mean what is experienced inwardly, emotionally, and not the outward acts of love, such as lovemaking, kissing, or embracing. Of course, there are also artistic motives that evoke the notion of love, such as the heart or certain flowers, such as roses. Love can be personified, as in the case of Venus, the goddess of love, or it can be personified as allegorically. But how can love that is experienced inwardly be represented visually? In my opinion, in his work, traditionally known by the title The Jewish Bride, Rembrandt gives visual expression to this inner experience of love. This is a later work, in all probability painted between 1665 to 1667. The title traditionally given to the painting is incorrect and misleading. In the early 19th century, an Amsterdam art dealer imagined that what he saw in the painting was a Jewish father and his daughter on her wedding day. There have been many interpretations since, for example, Rembrandt's son Titus with his bride, or various couples from the Old Testament. Most probably what we are dealing with here is the story of Isaac and Rebekah, as it is told in the book of Genesis, chapter 26. This interpretation is supported by a draft sketch that Rembrandt did for the painting. The sketch shows Isaac and Rebekah being spied upon by Abimelech. I imagine that you can't see Abimelech. He is above the male figure in the left upper corner. And this drawing was possibly inspired by a fresco painting by Raphael located in the loggia of the Vatican Palace, a painting that could have been known to Rembrandt thanks to graphic reproductions. Rembrandt's manner of approaching a subject becomes very clear here. He takes an original model as his point of departure, a model that he then alters in his own specific way, namely by removing the scene from its concrete narrative context, in the case at hand of the Old Testament narrative. He eliminates the storyline and any references that have an allegorical or motive character. He dissociates a history painting from its specific time reference. He universalizes the relationship between the persons portrayed. Thus, in the case at hand, it is no longer Isaac and Rebekah. What is crucial is not the search for and find a story or a model on which the work is possibly based. It is not to identify a theme, a traditional iconography, here Isaac and Rebekah. Rather, quite on the contrary, it is to understand that Rembrandt is in effect focusing on the fundamental structure, the anthropological essence of the story. At the same time, he gives his protagonists portrait-like features, which explains why many art historians endeavor to identify the persons portrayed. Some seeing here, for example, Titus and his bride. Rembrandt thus brings the biblical episode to life. In something of a reversal, it is now the parable aspect of the scene that is detected in what are perceived as living persons. What remains is a love relationship between man and woman. Whether it is actually was an engraving after Raphael or a school that inspired Rembrandt is a question that can remain unanswered for now. What we are in a position to affirm, however, are specific details that significantly distinguish the painting from the sketch. In the painting, all the genre-like features of the sketch, such as the voyeuristic personage and the table with the drinking vessels, were removed for the sake of a narrow focus on the subject. Behind the couple, all that remains visible is a hint of an architectural element, the arched shadow of which reinforces the idea of the two figures being linked. The motive of a sitting pose, which X-ray analysis shows to have once been much more visible, has been narrowed down to such an extent that it is now hardly possible to see that the young lady is sitting on the man's knee. In the sketch, the man is shown in profile. In the painting, he is seen in three-quarter profile, which is a significant difference. He is no longer looking at the woman, the object of his desire. He seems rather to be looking into himself. Nor is the woman looking at him. The love relationship is of course indicated by an embrace. The man has put his left arm around the woman's shoulders. His right hand is touching her bosom. She, for her part, is touching his hand with the fingers of her left hand, while she holds her right hand over her loins. There is contact between the two figures, but it is so gentle that it hardly gives the impression of actual physical contact. The man's hand is outstretched. A shadow makes it seem as if this hand were floating in air in front of the woman's body. It is as if the haptic, the tactile aspect of the scene has fused into the paint itself. Paint that has been applied in thick multiple layers. Rembrandt worked not only with a brush, he also used a palette knife and at times his hands. Numerous layers of different colors, each layer visibly painted over the one painted before it, produce in places clumps of color that stand out in relief, and in other places merely a subtle glaze. Here the layering itself can be seen as evoking the unfathomable depth of the emotion that radiates from within. The choice of colors reinforces this impression, bright red and warm gold. The two figures form a perfect triangle. The bending of the arms and the placement of the hands accentuate the connection between the two figures. In spite of the overall composition and the gestures portrayal, all of which emphasize the idea of togetherness, each of the figures, in a sense, stands alone. In particular, the inward gaze that one sees on both faces evokes the impression of love that is experienced inwardly. And so it is that in Rembrandt's painting, the impression of love is achieved not merely by means of the motive of an embrace, but by the entire way in which the scene has been conceived and portrayed. Here the notion of love is literally translated into form, color, and lighting. Rembrandt has tried to make the invisible visible, to make the invisible emotion of love visual. And he has done this by removing the subject from its narrative context, by narrowing the visual focus down to the couple, by his composition of the scene, which emphasizes togetherness, by the gestures portrayed, by the inward gaze, by the colors, red and gold, their layering and their contrasting luminosity. We come to the second point, ambivalent emotions. We have seen that in Christianity, basic human emotions were declared mortal sins. On the other hand, good versus evil came to be seen as a rigorous dichotomy. Ethics was always closely linked to the doctrine of affections, or of the doctrine of affects, as it is sometimes called. In antiquity, the notion of evil did not exist. There was the notion of bad, that is the opposite of good. And when it came to evaluating emotions, what mattered most was the idea of the right balance, the adequateness of emotions. Such a thing as justified anger, for example, was perfectly conceivable, but in Christianity, all ambivalence had to be done away. I want to show you now this painting by Rembrandt that in English usually goes by the title Hyman Recognizes His Fate, which Rembrandt painted around 1665. The story itself was taken from the book of Esther, which occurs in the later part of the Old Testament, dating most likely from the 3rd century BC. The Persian king Ahasuerus has a Jewish wife, but he doesn't know that she is Jewish. His Grand Vizier Haman is plotting to kill the Jew Mordecai as well as the other Jewish of the kingdom. Esther discovers the plot, goes to Ahasuerus, and reveals the truth about herself as being Jewish, as well as Haman's plot. The king then orders Haman to parade Mordecai through the city in a triumphal procession, whereupon Haman is executed. Rembrandt often based his work on scenes taken from the Book of Esther. Significantly, no agreement has been reached in the research as to what title should be given to this painting, nor even as to the theme actually being treated. It seems to me very likely that the figure in the foreground with his hand placed over his heart is meant to be Haman, which would mean that the crowned figure on the right is King Ahasuerus and the old man Mordecai. Research strays from the point, however, when it tries to identify a specific moment in the narrative. The moment, for example, when the king orders Haman to parade Mordecai through the city in a triumphal procession. In the actual story, Mordecai is not present during this scene. And besides, the distressed look on his face would remain unexplainable. It is significant that a specific textual reference cannot be established, that a concrete passage in the narrative cannot be identified. And this is not merely due to the time gap between Rembrandt's epoch and ours. I'm sure that Rembrandt's contemporaries also had trouble trying to solve the riddle. They had never seen any painting like this. Rather, it can be explained by the fact that the artist has totally eliminated any recognizable storyline or setting and has reduced the focus to 3 personages, and even they can only partly be seen, their faces having become the absolute center of attention. The only gesture has been included in the composition is that of the hand of Haman. It is the fact that hands as vehicles of expression play an important role in Rembrandt's oeuvre. The deep shadow falls over Haman's closed eyes like a blindfold. This reminded Otto Pecht of the verbal image, and I quote, having his head covered, a phrase that occurs in the book of Esther, an image that could possibly have inspired Rembrandt. It must be said, however, that wheeling the head as a means of portraying the unportrayable is a topos that dates back to antiquity and is specifically a reference to the story of the Greek painter Timanthes of Kythnos, a story that was known in Renaissance and Baroque times thanks to Latin sources, namely Pliny the Elder's Naturalis Historia and Cicero's De Oratore. Rembrandt was familiar with the story thanks to Karel van Mander's rendering of the episode in his didactic poem Schilderbuch. The original story tells of Timanthes' attempt to paint the sacrifice of Iphigenia. He wanted to portray the drama and the agony that could be seen on the faces of the bystanders. However, he did not feel himself capable of portraying Agamemnon's countenance as well. For in order to do so, he would have to show not only Agamemnon's immeasurable pain at losing his daughter, but also his feeling of guilt. This complex task exceeded the possibilities of visual representation. Thus, Simantes resorted to the artifice of covering Agamemnon's face with a veil, so leaving to the spectators to imagine what's going on. It seems to me that Rembrandt took up the challenge, that is, the challenge of visually rendering both emotional pain and guilt per se in the same character, and specifically in the character's face. It was the challenge of making the unportrayable, the invisible, visible. I show you another example, and this is the story of Potiphar's wife. You know, the episode is taken from the biblical story of Joseph. In the story, Potiphar's wife is portrayed as the epitome of the seductress. She's the wife of Potiphar, of the Egyptian king, and she wants to seduce Joseph, but Joseph flies away. And you see here the early dated graphic by Rembrandt, but already here it is not the dichotomy of an evil seductive woman versus an innocent Joseph that is depicted. Rather, what is depicted is the drama of desire. And much clearer, and this is in the painting, in the later painting, Joseph and Potiphar's wife. And here you see that Potiphar actually calls her husband, the Pharaoh, and tells her that actually Joseph wanted to seduce her, so she is lying. But what you see is what Rembrandt tries to show are human beings as psychologically complex, ambivalent, full of contradictions. You see also here Potiphar's wife, the seductress, and you can imagine all the contradicting feelings of her, of desire, and yes, everything that goes with this, actually. So, what does it mean now to approach the subject of representation of emotion from the perspective of cultural analysis? The portrayal of emotions has, in a general way, simply been associated with the genius of Rembrandt. When you read art history, and this is of course also true, you always read that Rembrandt is a great artist who can show emotion. That's true. And it's always, shown that it is caused also by his biography. That's all true. But as I see it, any research oriented toward cultural analysis and aimed at inquiring into how discourse surrounding the affective has evolved over the course of history must consider the artistic representations that are of concern to it within the context of the literary and theoretical discourse of the times in which those works were produced. Making good was clearly a deficit in this regard, would require conceiving a broad-based research project. In what follows, I would like to make a few observations and offer a few reflections that seem to me particularly relevant here. Konstantin Huygens was able to see emotive expressivity as the decisive criterion for quality, only because passions and emotions had become the topic of discussion par excellence. The notion of affect evolved during the 17th century into what was considered a key notion when it came to understanding the world and the self. In other words, the discourse surrounding the notion of affect reached an apogee in the 17th century. For example, the legal scholar and philosopher Christian Thomasius held the view that knowledge concerning emotions was, I quote, the most necessary of sciences, saying that without this knowledge, a person cannot possibly make progress in the world. And this assessment was to be valid for the eras of hermeneutics, moral didactics, rhetoric, medicine, and therapy and ethics. The portrayal of emotions was not only a defining aspect of Baroque theatre, of the Counter-Reformation, and of the aristocratic court. It was also a defining aspect of bourgeois Holland. What is striking, however, is not only the high priority given to passions in the fine arts, literature, and theatre, but also the very way in which passions were discussed, as well as where things having to do with affect were discussed. A significant change had taken place as to whose domain such discussion was assumed to be. It was no longer primarily the field of theology and rhetoric that concerned themselves with things affective. It was now philosophy, and in particular Descartes and Spinoza. In France, Malebranche, and in England, Hobbes. What this means is that it was no longer a matter of moralizing emotions, as theology had always done, nor was it a matter of learning how to deal with emotions in rhetoric. Rather, the emphasis was now on examining, analyzing emotions, their causes, and the way in which they were interlinked, as well as how they related to the body and the soul. It was a matter of constituting a body of knowledge concerning the realm of the affective. Descartes' treatise, Les Passions de l'âme, the passions of the soul, published in 1649, is, in my view, of particular relevance. This fundamental work, which has had a lasting influence, was written in Amsterdam, that is, in the same place where Rembrandt was working at the same time. We don't know whether the artist and the philosopher ever met, whether Descartes ever saw Rembrandt's painting, or inversely, whether Rembrandt had any direct contact with the philosopher's writings. The following thoughts, which I'd like to share with you, are therefore not to be misunderstood as suggesting a direct influence. In the humanity, including art history, there is a frequent tendency to shorten the connection between artistic production and normative published text, so as to create the impression of a direct interdependency. What I see are analogous structures that are shared by Rembrandt's artistic transpositions on the one hand and Descartes' theoretical formulations on the other. An explanation for this inner kinship can be found in the fact that both men shared a living environment and had common types of experiences in bourgeois Amsterdam. a city which at the time was undoubtedly the freest of the Western world. The artist and the philosopher, each in his specific way, transposed and portrayed those experiences. When one reads Les Passions, the Passions, one realizes, contrarily to a frequently distorted understanding, that Descartes saw emotions as a constituent part of the human being that is both necessary and useful. His separation of the body from the mind by no means implies a separation between reason and emotion. According to Descartes' conception, emotions are a threshold phenomenon. They are an intermediary between the body and the soul. This mediation takes place through the agency of animal spirits. In French, esprit animaux, and in German, yeah, it's okay, leave it in English, animal spirits, the seat of which is located in the pineal gland of the brain. In German, pineal gland is die Zirbeldrüse. Structurally, this entire conception is altogether similar to what modern neurobiology conceives as an interlinking of the physical and the psychic in the switching centers of the brain. Descartes is interested above all in questions of ethics. What he has set out to demonstrate is that the human being is able, by his or her own will, to direct emotions, notions and drives that are generated by the animal spirits independently of his or her will. Regarding the connection to Rembrandt, what interests me personally, both in Descartes' Les Passions and in the somewhat later work by Spinoza, his treatise entitled Ethics, are certain viewpoints expressed that describe emotions as an inner, subjective, and complex phenomenon. Viewpoints that signal a new way of understanding psychological processes. In the Aristotelian tradition, emotions were always a passive reaction to external stimuli. Emotions had an object and a cause in the external world, and for that reason they were seen as passio, as something suffered passively. In spite of the fact that Descartes sought emphatically to distance himself from the ancients, he followed the fundamental notion of active and passive capacities of the soul. Although, with respect to emotions, he conceded that the soul was also endowed with decidedly active capacity as well. In Descartes' view, how things affect us depends no longer on the characteristic that those things possess, but rather on the significance that we assign to them. A transfer has taken place. He locates the causes of certain emotions in the subject's inner world. Indeed, this consciousness of feeling is what actually constitutes subjectivity in the modern sense of the term. In defining passions, Descartes makes a threefold distinction, namely, things perceived that are external to the body, which he refers to as perception, things perceived that have bodily causes, these he refers to as sensations, and thirdly, emotions, which arise exclusively from within the soul itself. the conception that emotions arise from within the soul is new and prepares the ground for the development of what will become psychology. This looking into the soul is in effect secularized for a form of introspection, which, in contrast to the Christian medieval tradition, is no longer linked to a divine authority. For both Descartes and Spinoza, things conceived, imagined, or recollected are just as capable of generating emotions as concrete things that are actually present. It is often the case that the initial cause of a specific emotion is totally absent from a person's consciousness or memory because the cause in question occurred in the person's early childhood. In this regard, Descartes gives two examples, and allow me now to quote Descartes. It will be enough for me to repeat the principle on which all that I have written about is founded, namely that there exists such a connection between the soul and the body that once we have attached any given bodily action to any given thought, the one never presents itself to us without the other, and that we do not always attach the same actions to the same thoughts. And for example, it is easy to, I still quote Descartes, okay? And for example, it is easy to conceive that the strange aversions that prevent some people from being able to tolerate the smell of roses, or the presence of a cat, or other similar things that can be explained by the fact that at the very beginning of their life, they were strongly repelled by things of this kind. And the smell of roses may have given a great headache to an infant in its cradle, or a cat might have frightened it terribly without anyone noticing, or without the child later in life ever having any recollection of it, even though the aversion that he had at the time for the roses or the cat remains engraved in his memory for the rest of his life. End of quote. Today we cannot accept Descartes' physiological explanation that posits the agency of spirits embedded in a fold of the brain. But we can, however, go along with his articulation of what is behind this conception, namely the experience of unconscious emotions that have their origin in childhood, emotions that the individual experiences subjectively, while at the same time being unable to explain them. Later, Sigmund Freud interpreted these phenomena psychoanalytically, and brain research indicates that conscious memory starts to develop only at about of the age of 3. So if you have an experience in your very early childhood, before you are 3 years old, you can't remember it, it's impossible, but it has an effect on you. So actually, Descartes, giving a very funny explanation, but he realizes this fact. In my view, both Descartes and Spinoza, in their discursive approach to the human psyche, in their attempts to formulate its enigmatic, complex, and contradictory nature, show themselves akin to Rembrandt. In spite of enumerating what they consider to be the basic emotions, both Descartes and Spinoza recognize the existence of mixed emotions and consequently countless possible emotional states, recognizing as a corollary to this something that I find particularly noteworthy, that an individual can experience totally conflicting emotions simultaneously. And Descartes describes this in a passage that I would like to quote for you. I quote now Descartes again. And although these emotions of the soul can often be joined with passions that are similar to them, they can often come in contact with other passions as well, and can even arise from passions that are contrary to them. For example, when a husband mourns his deceased wife, a wife whom, as it sometimes happens, he would be quite annoyed to see brought back to life, it is possible that his heart could pain him because of the sadness caused in him by the solemnity of the funeral and the absence of a person to whom conversation he had become accustomed. And it is possible that some remnants of love or pity that might present themselves to his imagination could draw true tears in his eyes, notwithstanding which he could at the same time secretly feel a sense of joy in the innermost part of his soul, end of quote. So you see, Descartes realizes that you can have in the same time completely contradictory feelings. And think of Hamann, what I showed you, and Potiphar. So I think that it is very similar to what Rembrandt showed in his paintings. Descartes also writes about love. Here, significantly, he makes no mention of any outward signs, although he does so in the case of anger, fright, or other emotions. In contrast to other emotions, which he describes in great detail, love effects cannot be read, as it were, on the body. The heartbeat is stronger, he writes, but regular, and there is a sweet warmth in the bosom. Also, in his discussion of the passions of the soul, Descartes opposes the traditional notion of a separation between benevolent love and concupiscent love. In their essence, they are both the same, he writes. They only differ in the effects they produce. In my view, overcoming this age-old theological dichotomy of eros versus agape, of sensual love and love to God, and along with it the condemnation of sensual love, this opens a way to a new definition of love. I show you this painting by Rembrandt of Samson giving riddles on the feast of his wedding. And the point in this painting is that you see that you have here very different individuals. Every person reacts completely differently. But the point is that actually Samson gives a riddle, but the real riddle is his wife, Delilah, who, as you know from the story, will betray him. But he doesn't know this. She sits here, and you can't see actually her feelings because it's an inner thing, and he gives riddles. But he doesn't realize the real riddle, which is actually his wife, because emotions, feelings are not to be seen. I see Rembrandt's artistic portrayals, especially his later work, and the writings of both philosophers, Descartes and Spinoza, as being kindred. First of all, because of the fundamental importance that all of them attribute to human emotions, but also because they clearly realize that emotions can be multifaceted, overlapping and therefore mutually contradictory. They understood that emotions have different individual characteristics and that they often remain unconscious. The philosophical theories on the one hand and Rembrandt's pictorial works on the other all result from human experiences of ambivalent emotional states, experiences that became the object of special attention and analysis. This having been said, however, we are also struck by the differences, and we see that as a result of these differences, the artistic works on the one hand and the philosophical writings on the other produce different effects and have different kinds of relevance for today's reader and viewer. Descartes, for example, acknowledges that emotional reactions can be different according to the individual. He writes, and I quote, "The same impression that the person of a horrifying object can produce in the gland and that causes fear in some persons can arouse courage and boldness in others. The reason for this being that all brains are not organized in the same fashion." End of quote. Descartes' pertinent observation that emotional constitution varies according to individual is, however, accompanied by a biological explanation that we are unable to accept today. By contrast, when considering the works of Rembrandt, one is able to comprehend in quite a different way this differentiation among individuals, as differentiation that is now being made artistically in the portrayal of various characters, each having his or her specific emotional reactions. The differences can in each case be read as stemming from social, age-based or gender-based causes. One need only think of Rembrandt's history paintings, in which numerous characters react to the same event in different ways, as, for example, Samson posing the Vogl at the wedding feast. What we observe here is enlightening when it comes to understanding the relationship between, on the one hand, artistic portrayals of certain phenomena that, by virtue of a shared cultural perspective, are perceived by artist and philosopher alike, and on the other hand, the theoretical explanation of their causes. It seems that art is in a better position than theoretical explanations when it comes to conveying these experiences to us today in a way that allows us actually to comprehend them. So I think that there is such a similarity between the thinking of the philosophers and Rembrandt, but the theoretical explanations by Descartes and Spinoza, we can't follow them today. But as structurally thinking, Descartes and Spinoza realized a lot. But we can without, distancing us, understand paintings by Rembrandt. So I think that art, can show us this kind of emotions in a very different way as these philosophical explanations can. It must be pointed out that at the same time there were also completely different forms of representations of emotion. The Baroque era, Italy or Rubens, it's very different. The body articulates what is taking place in the soul. You can see these enormous gestures, and it's not like in Rembrandt that he shows that emotions are taking place in your inner soul. By privileging the face as a medium through which the affective inner world of the individual is expressed, Rembrandt, in his later work, distinguishes himself from the entire Italian Renaissance tradition as well as from his Baroque contemporaries. One only need to think of Rubens, for example. In those artistic traditions, the inner movements of the human soul are expressed by the body and by gestures. These conceptions spring from a dispositive that the Renaissance borrowed from antiquity. That dispositive or conceptual apparatus is based on the notion that affective processes that take place within the human being manifest themselves as outward bodily signs that can be read. A virtually natural relationship is assumed to exist between, on the one hand, the outward manifestation, movements of the body, gestures and facial expressions, and on the other hand, the individual's psyche. The theoretical foundation for this conception is to be found in humoral medicine and in the rhetoric associated with humoral theory. I will, in the next lecture, we will talk about melancholy, so we will have the opportunity to talk about this a bit more precisely. It was especially the rhetoric of Aristotle, Cicero, and Quintilian that became influential in this respect. In the visual arts, as in the dramatic arts, a set of established guidelines for gestures, or in Latin, actio, were of particular relevance. These theoretical guidelines pertained to non-verbal communication. Speech was to be accompanied by commensurate body language. According to Quintilian, wordless gesture in a picture could make an impression on the heart that could surpass the effect of an orator's words. Leon Battista Alberti, citing the dictum ut pictura poesis, as is painting, so is poetry, claimed the basic rule of rhetoric for the visual arts as well. In his treatise on painting, De la Pittura, first published in 1435, in addition to imitatio, inventio, and the three musts of the orator, namely docere, delectare, and movere, he demands that the painter be able to portray emotions adequately by means of bodily movements and gestures. Leonardo considered that the expression of human feelings through bodily attitude and movement was that upon which pictorial art was based. And allow me to quote Leonardo, I say it in Italian and then in English. Il buon pittore ha da dipingere due cose principali, cioè l'uomo ed il concetto della mente sua. Il primo è facile, il secondo difficile, perché si ha a figurare con gesti e movimenti della membra. In English, the good painter has two main things to paint, namely man and what is taking place in his mind. The third is easy, the second is difficult, because it has to be shown by means of gestures and movements of the limbs. Leonardo recommended not only the study of the art of antiquity, but also that of sources that were beyond the artistic realm, such as observation of preachers and deaf mutes. There was no lexicon of gestures and their meaning, but there was, however, a form of handed-down knowledge concerning what the German art historians Ebbe Warburg termed Pathos formen, in English, Pathos formulas, In the conduct literature of the 16th century, and most notably in Baldassare Castiglione's Il Libro del Cortegiano, the rules of rhetoric pertaining to actio became practical rules of conduct. And this practice went on also to the 18th century, actually to the 19th century, and partially also to today's. This imagination that you can see in the face or in the body what happens inside you. The practice of art of physiognomy, for its part, aimed at discovering the truth of a person's character, as it were, hidden behind what were possibly distortions and forms of camouflage that had been learned. In the words of the famous Renaissance physiognomist Giambattista della Porta, I quote, "Physiognomy is an almost divine science, for through the study of the outer features that can be observed on the human body, it makes it possible to discover a person's moral makeup and nature. It seems to be able to make its way to the deepest places of the soul, to the most intimate places of the heart," quote, end of quote. Thus, the physiognomic discourse served not only the aim of discovering the individual's so-called inner truth, but also that of putting things down in writing so that norms could be established, and this ultimately for the sake of unambiguous readability. Rembrandt shared this physiognomist's interest in the significance of the human face as revealing what might be taking place in a person's inner self. However, his approach was diametrically opposed to theirs when it came to categorizing and establishing single semantic interpretations. On the contrary, he endeavored to show the unfathomable nature, the ambiguity, the multiplicity of possible meanings of human facial expression. The artistic and philosophical positions that I have mentioned here are different. Indeed, contrary ways of approaching and responding to one and the same phenomenon, namely that of individualizing and privatizing things perceived and experienced, a process in which the face plays a central role when it comes to self-observation and observation of others. I stop here. I know that it is a very complex field, and I just want to draw your attention to my book. I wrote a book. It is translated into English, The Visible and the Invisible, on Dutch painting of the 17th century. And there, in part 2, I have a chapter 5, where I wrote about affect, emotion, and imagination, much more differentiated as I could do it now. So if you have any interest, I can tell you that this is a possible way to get more information about this. And I stop here, and we see each other on Wednesdays, where we will talk about melancholy. Yes, goodbye.